Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the 8th edition of UCD in Conversation, a webinar series hosted by UCD Alumni Relations. My name is Ria Flom, and I coordinate our volunteering programs. Today, we are thrilled to welcome you, our friends from around the world, to this series to listen as UCD academics and alumni share their stories, insights, and ideas. This series is also reflective of UCD's new strategy entitled Rising to the Future, and its 4 strategic themes, which focus on UCD's contribution to global challenges. These are creating a sustainable global society, transforming through digital technology, building a healthy world, and empowering humanity. As many of you will know, UCD has been at the forefront of the efforts fighting COVID-19, and we're committed to supporting our students through this difficult time. To date, generous alumni and friends of UCD like you have helped to raise over €200,000 to provide urgent financial and mental health supports to students who need it most. So thank you to those who have already given to this important cause. If you'd like to support our efforts, you can visit the link which is being posted in the chat box in your own time. The format for this evening's event will be a 30-minute conversation followed by a Q&A session. We'll wrap up at about 7:45 or 8 p.m. Please feel free to submit your questions through the conversation Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. We'll be sure to get to as many as we can, but time is limited and we can sure talk, and so we mightn't be able to get to address every single question. If for whatever reason you have to leave the conversation early or have any problems with connectivity, don't worry. We'll be streaming this live on Facebook, and we'll also be recording this session so you'll be able to view it afterwards on the UCD Alumni YouTube channel. In a few moments, I'll hand over to Dr. Ebun Joseph and Dr. Alice Feldman to explore this evening's topic. So what next? Becoming anti-racist. And you can see them there. Dr. Ebun Joseph is a preeminent leader, race relations consultant, career development specialist, and module coordinator for UCD's Black Studies module, Ireland's First. Dr. Alice Feldman is a researcher, advisor, and consultant. She's a member of the UCD School of Sociology and the convener of the MA in Race, Migration and Decolonial Studies, a first in Ireland and Europe. They both have graciously agreed to be here today to help us to explore the concepts and history of race, white supremacy, white fragility, and more. And they will offer us perspectives on how personally and collectively we can listen, learn, and take action to become anti-racist. If this is a familiar topic to you, or if this is something that you've started to explore more recently, we want to acknowledge you for showing up today and for continuing to seek understanding. Education can be a catalyst for change. So now, without further ado, over to you, Alice and Ebun.
Thank you so much, Ria, for this opportunity to bring Alice and I together. Again, it's an interesting one because Alice, I'm like 45 minutes. We spent that just doing introduction alone, but just to say that, Alice and I have a long working relationship. Alice supervised my doctorate degree, which I finished in 2015. But since then, it's been very interesting that we've grown from being supervisor and supervisee relationship to becoming friends and allies and colleagues, and to just even working so strongly together. So just to say, that be comfortable if I interrupt her and she interrupts me, it's fine, because we do that all the time, in the last, I think 4 years now, we meet maybe once every month or something, and we both love chicken. I'm a girl of African descent, and I always say something, that's one time where I truly fit the stereotype, So we always joke about that. I say we both fit the stereotypes. Americans are said to like, chicken, and people of African descent are said. So we both choose to fit that stereotype, and we always meet over a bowl of chicken, and we spend like 3 hours just talking about race and just everything and life generally. So just, be comfortable when we jump into each other's what we're saying. It's fine. We're not being rude. We're just doing we're doing us, and hopefully I think hopefully that we will also begin to even see that space, where we talk about what we are in today, the space we're in today, where we're talking about allyship, that it's not an uncomfortable space where we are walking on eggshells, not knowing how to talk to each other, and how to be with each other, just to say that, in the conversations we'll be having with you today, we'll be using the word we. You know, we won't just only be saying black people and white people and, you know, BAME, or, you know, there's so many acronyms we use now. We'll be saying we. We'll say we a lot because, you know, black, white, we are all part of this thing called the system. We're all part of this society, so that one group are not separated from the other, that we are all, you know, even while we experience all the isms that we have in society, that we are all, you know, part of that.
Yeah. And we're all part of doing the work together. It's all of our work. We're all involved in it. And that's why the we is, it's a multiple we. So yeah, when we're talking, that's kind of what we mean. So we're not talking about anything necessarily, anyone in particular. So we kind of see it as our whole world that we're in. Yeah.
So if you look at like this current moment, Alice, you know, like where we are now.
Yeah. Well, I think, and that's why we need to have these conversations. Because I think in Ireland, in the world, there's this profound sense of what's at stake and what's possible. And I think Ebun and I were, you know, when Rhea approached us, we were in agreement that one of the biggest obstacle, if not the biggest obstacle, to the possibilities for change on a massive scale that we're only now seeing the beginnings of, is the fact that white people, and now it's we, but white people are so unable to even talk about race and racism, even to use the word black people and white people. And if you can't talk about it, we can't move on, we can't do anything about it. And one of the things when we were out for one of our chicken dinners, it came, this young white guy came to take our order, and we were trying to decide on how spicy we wanted it, right? So, so I said to him, I said, well, how hot is hot? Is it white people's hot? Not, you know, is that what we're talking about? White people's hot. And, you know, he sort of did this really cute sort of snort and laugh, you know, and then he paused and he said, thank you, really emphatically. He said, thank you. And it was really poignant. It was funny, but it was poignant at that time, where it just showed that it was almost like he never felt. He was sitting there taking people's hours. The discussion about how hot and white hot and black hot were always there in the background, even if they weren't being spoken. And he didn't even feel that he could say white people's hot, you know? So that's when I started realizing just how deep that it goes, and that inability to, you know, if we can't do anything about racism, we can't be anti-racist, if we can't see it, if we can't name it and talk about it. And with that inability to name and to talk comes the inability to hear, to listen, to take on board, and therefore to act on the work and do the work of anti-racism. So I think it gives a lot of depth to that slogan that was coming up in a lot of the protests: white silence is violence. Because, and that's why one of the things where we felt it was important to start with is the issue of white fragility. So we'll be talking about that a lot, and how white people can start feeling, you know, examining kind of their own feelings about whiteness and racism, and to be able to unpack that and then take action.
Okay. So again, I don't know, Rhea, if you're, because I'm on Twitter, so I like Twitter a lot. So, you know, so for those who are not able to be here today, so if you're able to tweet about it, so if you're tweeting, please tag me, or I don't know if Rhea, if you have a hashtag, so if you put it in the chat or the comment section. And so if you do tag me, so that, you know, tomorrow we can retweet, or when I get out of here, we can retweet and we can capture some of these, so that people who are not here can also get some of these. Because for me, it's really important. It's not just about the, you know, the 200 of us who are listening right now, when it's about a bigger conversation. Remember that if we cannot talk about this, we cannot change it. So we need people talking about it. We need people talking, we need people listening, you know, and that's where that change, that we're talking about really comes from, you know. So what I'll try to do, you know, because of the limited time we have, I'm going to just, you know, call through some statements, you know. We won't have enough time to deconstruct all the statements, but some of them are actually quite self-explanatory on their own, you know, and, you know, so again, so some of them are explanatory, but even if I start with the basic one is that if you cannot talk about the issue of race or racism for more than 10 minutes without being uncomfortable and getting red all over the skin, you know, then there's a problem there. You know, I'll try to say it politically, but the last time I said that, I said, you're part of the problem. Because we need you to be comfortable with talking about race and racism without being uncomfortable, without getting red. Because your uncomfortableness, sometimes what it does to us is that it's a shut up experience, you know, for us, you know. It also means that we end up trying to, and we go into white fragility, but it also means that we're also constantly trying to then help you feel comfortable. So then we then water down what we want to say. You know, so no, so let's not be uncomfortable. You know, we can talk about every topic, you know. So why is it that it's the issue of race or racism that we are uncomfortable with? And that's why changes are not happening. So make sure, you know, going from here, that you're able to have a good conversation, you know, about race and racism and enjoy the uncomfortableness. That's how we learn, okay? Well, another statement we have there is that there's no such thing as not a racist, okay? You know, so it's either you are a racist or you are an anti-racist. And so when we look at that, and a lot of us have begun to say that, and a lot of us have begun to understand what it means, you know, so that you're either a racist or an anti-racist. So somebody who says, I'm not a racist, I put a question out on Twitter about that, what does it mean to be not a racist, you know? So really, somebody who says, I'm not a racist is actually just a racist in denial. You know, because the main thing that we use is that white denial. It is the biggest weapon of against racism, against addressing the issue of racism, is this denial. We deny it. So it's the biggest weapon. We use that, we weaponize that denial, you know, and people, rather than actually focusing on the issue that happened, we then begin to focus on whether you're racist or not. Is this racism or not? No, something happened. So we shift. You see what that does? It's a deflector. It deflects you from actually looking at the issue at hand, and then you begin to worry about semantics. Are you racist or not? The fact is the person is on the middle of the road, is dying, you know, and then we're asking questions, was this racist or not? You know, so again, so key things like that, you know, so there's no in between. You know, and so when we get comfortable with that, you know, we want to look at that, you know. Alice, you want to add some of the ones that we look at?
Let's say, you know, there are issues that
I think we have one there that says that no whiteness outside of white supremacy.
Right. Yeah, it's like, oh, you left me the difficult one. The really right. And it's important. It's important to know that these statements, yes, they can be uncomfortable, they can be challenging and all this, but we actually find these statements incredibly liberating. Because when you say something like, there is no whiteness outside of white supremacy, and I heard this statement first by Sandana Berry, and she was part of a panel on, the whole conference was about the burdens of white empathy, which, you know, is a really terrible thing, but that's kind of where we're at until we start dealing with whiteness, that even something natural or that you feel is natural, like empathy, can be very problematic and actually a burden for Black and people of color. But so this idea that there's no whiteness outside of white supremacy has to do with the fact that we all learn and are taught racism. So we all have to learn and be taught anti-racism. Because we're so, and there's a whole long, well, there's at least 500 years of history around white supremacy and all of the ways in which it has come to be completely infused in our world, and we're all socialized into these systems and these orders that all stem from the issue of white superiority and Black inferiority, and we've got sciences and literatures for hundreds of years about that. So in a way, it's very liberating to say that, because it's like, now we know, we know that we're part of this, we're socialized into it. We also know that it's something we've learned, it's something we can relearn or unlearn. We can learn anti-racism, and it gives us, there's something that we can do about it. And I think that's also where we were talking about, you don't have to be a racist to do racist things, right? Or to benefit from racism. But ultimately too with this is that we are not defined by our color, all right? So it's not a matter of feeling bad or feeling guilty or all of this weight of being whiteness. There's things that we can do. You can do something with your whiteness. And kind of one of the things that we're talking about today is how do we, and I think part of our conversation and the way in which we talk about things, we use terms like whiteness and white supremacy and Black and white people and all of this sort of things. And this is the way that we need to be able to talk about it.
And I think that even if I add, like one of the things, like even when the way you teach the decolonial studies and I teach, Black studies, and so we've talked about how do we, most of those classes are, you're either teaching, a whole, class of white students, and you're going to teach them things that might make them uncomfortable sometimes, And I think that, one of the things I do at the start of my class is I always remind people that stay with it. You're going to hear things that might be uncomfortable, but that this is a learning, is a moment that you can learn. So that even before we start the conversation, even before we start the course, before we start the lecture, at the beginning, you're in a group, you have your group agreements. So that's part of the agreement I make, and I remind people, I say, you might hear some things that are uncomfortable. You might hear some things that might, impact on the way you have seen the world, but stay with it. It's a learning process that we're creating a safe space where we can learn, where we can question, where we can challenge, and we can look at, the other side of things, and just like Alice said, if we look at the notion of race and racism, I think that most times we don't, before we even come to being anti-racist, we need to understand that the notion of race was created to separate a group of people as inferior and some people as superior. So when we talk about racism, it's really that belief, that understanding, that, when we agree with that notion that some people are superior to others, when we attribute people's behavior to their membership of a group, that in itself is the notion of racism. So when you attribute the thing that people do to their race, to their membership of that group, that is racism. So when we look at those of us, most of us who are alive today, most of us inherited the space of racism that we are in. So the question really is, we've inherited these racist spaces. What do you do with it? Do you keep that inheritance or do you try to change it? So that's why we begin to look at the anti-racist. The anti-racist is that person who looks at this inheritance of racism and say, I'm not keeping you. There was a really interesting, and I shared it yesterday at the webinar, there was a really interesting sign I saw somewhere and I took a picture of it, and it says that you should treat racism like COVID-19. Assume you have it. It was so funny. I was like, oh my God. It was just brilliant. He says, assume you have it. He said, treat racism like COVID-19. Assume you have it. Number 2, don't share it. Seriously, I was like, oh my God, this is absolutely apt. Like, don't share this racism. So really, really key. So and be willing to change your life to end it. And that's what we've done with COVID-19. And that's what it's saying about racism. And we're saying that racism is a pandemic, is a global pandemic. In fact, anti-Black racism is a global pandemic. And we're saying that to end it, we need anti-racists who are willing to change policies, change their lifestyle, change their belief system, challenge their things in their organizations to bring a change, and when we look at, people who are white, they have stages. A white person has to go through almost 5 stages, honestly, before they can truly listen and hear about whiteness.
Right. Well, and that's why we wanted to talk about this term white fragility that Robin DiAngelo has been working on for many years, because it's not just the fact that people have bad attitudes or people are good and bad or this. White fragility is a whole sort of system, I mean, in terms of inheriting things, a system of defensiveness. And I just want to read, like, really quickly from what she was saying about, and this is to quote from her, because as you were saying, in terms of the history of race and racism, right, and it isn't just an anecdote, it isn't just beliefs that have been handed on, it has been developed into scientific racism, all of the ways of proving it, medical, mental health, social sciences, human sciences. There have been, since the Enlightenment, all of our great thinkers, the ones that get taught over and over again all around the world. So it's not just that people have taken stuff on, but that's how it's so embedded in our society. And where Robin DiAngelo is coming from, she says, white people are so socialized into a deeply internalized sense of superiority, we become highly fragile in conversations about race. We consider a challenge to our racial worldviews, a challenge to our very identity as good and moral people, that we perceive any attempt to connect this to the system of racism as unsettling, as unfair, as a moral offense. And this is why, for many people, that even white people who are involved in social justice issues can be a big part of the problem, because we take it's taken personally. It's not that race is a system, but people feel that they're being told that they're not good or that they're bad people. So there's this fragility here. So the smallest amount of racial stress, she says, is intolerable. Okay, and this triggers this range of defensive mechanisms. So anger, fear, guilt, silence, withdrawal, dismissal, rationalization, face saving, because we're always like, but, virtue signaling, and also hysteria, homicide, and genocide. Okay, so and then on top of this, like you were saying, then we turn around and expect Black people to be rushing to make us feel better or reassure us or tell us what to do or to educate us as well, okay? And DiAngelo talks about all of these defensive measures, try to work to reinstate our equilibrium, okay? But they also repel the challenge, right? And so in a sense, she says that this works as a really powerful, obviously, form of white racial control, because we use it to deflect and we use it to close things down, to close the conversation. Because we can,
and that is so apt, to look at that, to look at the way that those conversations are shut up, and in fact, it's just going back to even looking at it that when somebody is doing something that is racist, that is not a fixed position, really. That you can actually be racist to your mother-in-law and not be racist to your Black wife. Do you understand? And so it's really understanding those spaces, and looking at, our fragility, that today I can be racist to my Black neighbor, but I'm not racist to my colleague who is in the office who've been working together for 12 years. And so looking at that ability that it changes, that looking at the issue that it changes across time and space, so when our fragility, when our white fragility is touched on, when something happens, and it's touched on, what do we do? I have a paper coming out soon, and I talk about, stories. What we do as whites is that we begin to tell stories. We begin to tell stories of a Black deficit. So just to regain our equilibrium, because you have said something, it's like, I think almost, I'm not sure, but I almost think that people feel that the worst insult they can get in life is to call them a racist. Like, my God, if you just say you're a racist, people just go really mad and really angry.
Yeah. Well, that's the whole thing. It's this always on the verge of hysteria. And that's why it's so dangerous and so frightening, right? You know, and to live with that for Black people and people of color, always knowing that anything, like you were saying, anything can trigger it as well. And even so, you've got this huge continuum and this huge extreme. So, because I started thinking, just a quick list, okay, of sort of typical things you might hear in Ireland or whatever, okay, in terms of different defensive mechanisms. So like, you know, white people can't be racist because we were victims of colonization or of racism ourselves. There's this term whataboutery. So you're talking about an experience you had or someone else had with racism, and someone will say, yeah, but there was this white guy who was mistakenly arrested as well, you know? There's the issue of like proximity, and someone saying, well, you know, I can't be racist because my cousin's married to a Black woman, you know? And I even noticed when the last couple of weeks after the protests protesting George Floyd's murder, there were a couple of weeks there where a lot of young Black Irish people were coming out and they were speaking about their experiences here in Ireland of racism and in schools and on the street. And a lot of the papers were carrying just long interviews and, you know, stories, really important stories from young people. And then after a couple of weeks, there was this article in one of the papers, and it was about this historic romance where this Irish guy, okay, in terms of proximity, so like my cousin, right? But this was in the Spanish Civil War. So in the 1930s, it was Irish man fell in love with African-American woman and got married, right? And you're thinking, you know, and I know that sounds really, you know, it's an interesting piece of history, blah, blah, blah. But if you're, you know, and once you start unpacking the racialized way the world works and your own fragility, and you start to see, you know, so you're never not going to see it again, right? So for people like us who do the work we do, we're like, really? You know, and that reflects the whole, and that whole discussion, right, where these young people were being so brave, you know, and sharing so much, that whole conversation, it completely washed, it was like the river shifting, and that conversation was gone.
Yeah, and you know, just to, you know, to remember that, you know, when people share their stories, you know, it's not an invitation to white people to come and say, oh yes, you know, to challenge the story or to say I don't believe you. No, it's not an invitation to tell 20 other stories, you know, of how, you know, you went into a place when you were fat, or when you went into a place where you know, where you were the only person. I'm like, you know, so it's not an invitation. You know, Delgado talks about it. He says there is benefit in people of color, in Black people telling their stories, but that there is massive benefit in you listening when they do. So the first thing in being allies or in doing this work or anti-racism is to just listen. It's to listen. It's to say, I don't understand this, but I believe you. You know, people just need you to believe them, you know, because when you don't believe them, what happens is you tell a story, you're telling a story, the person is standing in front of you, yet the fictional person who they have not seen, who did that thing against you, the person begins to defend that person that they have not seen. So at that time, you become a defender of white supremacy. There is an internal idea, there's an internal racist idea that you have bought into. And so rather than believing the person who's standing before you and telling you their story of racism, you would rather believe the internal image of white superiority. And so what do? You defend white supremacy by pushing back and resisting. So make sure, ask yourself, am I a defender of white supremacy? So we begin to talk about things like white rage. What is white rage? White rage you begin to look at issues where, you know, when you see somebody who just does not fit the stereotype, you know, when we have this image, you know, of blacks being at the bottom, being needy, can't speak English, you know, or can't do well. And then you then see them, they have 3 elites. What's the one they call me? Elite lecturer. I think that's my biggest trolls, you know, my trolls online. The first thing they attack is the fact that I'm a lecturer, lecturing across blah, 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 blah. I'm like, seriously, you know, it wasn't handed, right? I did work for it. I did, you know, I actually do teach that. You know, so when you look at white rage, you know, it's like anger, you know, anger that how can you be here? How can you have this? You know, and you walk it, so people, a lot of black people experience it when they go for conferences and you're the only black person there or 2 black people. They are looking at you and wondering, how are you here? You know, like when you go into the staff room and, you know, they see you sitting down and having your meal, not that you are mopping the floor, you know, and they're wondering, how are you? You can see the look you're getting. How are you here? How are you in this room? You know, and then they want to start digging in, you know. And you know that that question is not coming from just because I want to make conversation, because I really want to understand that you have a right to be in this room, you know? So you look at key things like that.
Yeah. Well, and even, I mean, it's the difference in, like you were saying, someone's telling you a story and you start from the premise, and you can even if you don't understand it, it's changing your whole orientation to, but I want to know more. You know, I believe what you're saying is true. I don't quite get it, but I want to know more and I want to learn more about it, rather than just that automatic, got to tear it down, got to pick it apart, got to try to dilute it in some way or another. But also, I mean, oh, I forgot what I was going to say, but there was something that you were saying in those examples that made me think of, the difference between going into the defensive mode and, you know, because one of the things I was thinking of when we were going through our list at the beginning for the audience of that I can't see, which is really hard for me, I'm very face-to-face, but when you were hearing those statements, right, you know, challenging, talking about things like fragility and discomfort and white supremacy, and we're all part of it, you know, stop and think, and monitor, how did that feel? What were your reactions? What were the things that you were, you know, immediately wanting to defend around that? And it's not just about learning how to be reflective and seeing where this is all coming from, and unpacking your own reactions and why, but it's also taking a completely different orientation to listening, to taking things on board. You know, and because even just that one example that we were talking about earlier, the woman in Central Park in New York, who was, you saw it right there on the video, right? She just flew into white hysteria, right? When she was falsely reporting that the man, I can't remember, they both had the same, Cooper, they both had the surname Cooper, right? And she was making a false report, right? And, you know, you could see the way this whole thing happens. And one of the things which stopped me in my tracks was a few days later when the governor, right, actually took that on board. He could have just rationalized it like it's always rationalized, politicians, government, institutions, and the whole lot. But he stopped, right? And he didn't do that. And he actually took that on board. And it wasn't just that he pushed to have a law saying that that was now illegal. It was against the law to make a false report. But it was the fact that he was sending a message that that is so completely out of the realm of human behavior that we're marking it. You know, and we're making a punitive thing, and I don't necessarily think that stops people. But if he hadn't been able to shift from a defensive thing to a, let me look at this, and wow, this is absolutely, you know, unacceptable, and made a change in the law. So you have a simple moment of reflection and then intervening in your own behavior, right? The white fragility, and taking something on board. that actually changed a law that will have massive effects on people's safety in terms of, no, we now have admitted as a world in some places, you know, that this is, so do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, and if you look at that as well, you know, it's just the fact that, like, even in that example as well, you know, you look at that it did not just end there. And that's why we're saying that people should unmute themselves. You know, that bystanders can kill. You know, so if you're just a bystander, if you're just there, oh, it happened, that's not enough. It's not good enough anymore, because nothing changes, you know, until something else happens. You know, so we look at it, and that's what we ask, you know, is there an in-between, racist, non-racist, you know? So you look at that kind of situation. So how does that relate even into our workplaces? And I was thinking of an example, even while you spoke there, is to look at that in Ireland and in most places. You know, if you feel you've been discriminated against, the onus is on you who's been discriminated against to prove that they've discriminated against you. So if you're an anti-racist and you want to flip that policy on the head, because remember, we talk about the fact that racism persists because of racist policies. If we do not have racist policies, racism will die. So racism, the policies maintain all this racist behavior. So when you look at that policy that you have to prove they've been racist against you. Now imagine if we change the policy in Ireland, that if somebody complains that you've been racist against them, you know, that your line manager has been racist against you. If it then becomes the onus of the line manager to prove that they were not racist against you, imagine how that would change. It means that the line manager will then have to go and dig up all the ways he has treated all the other staff and then compare it and come and prove to the organization that he has not been racist against you. It would totally flip. If, you know, in the labor market, in employment, in hospitals, if the onus is on you to prove that you've not been racist, and that is just a simple change in policy that we can do. And that's when we talk about racist policies, racist ideas, you know, that's what it is. So when people say, I'm not a racist is that the person is a racist in denial. If you've not read Ibrahim Kendi's book, I will ask you to read that book, you know, you can see, you know, some of that, you know. So again, so just realizing, you know, some of those spaces.
We've gone everywhere. We had a plan.
I guess also it's just looking at that, if you cannot admit, you know, that you are in a racist state, in a racist system, because it's really important, you know. And when we say white denial is not just saying, oh, there's no racism, you know, but we actually are able to admit that we live in a racist system, you know, that our societies are racist. You know, it was Gilborn, and David Gilborn talks about it, you know. He says that an attack on white supremacy is not an attack on white people. So my lectures always start with that. I always remind people that an attack on white supremacy is not an attack on white people. It's an attack on the systems that uphold white superiority. So you must understand that. If you don't understand that, you will internalize the blame. You will think that we're fighting white people. No, it's not about that. It's about the systems that uphold one group as superior to the other. That's all we're trying to change. Yeah. Somebody, you know, yeah, go on.
Yeah, well, but it's also a thing about will, you know, and it's sort of like, and you know, white people have agency to choose. I mean, that's why we're talking about doing the work. It's getting to the space where you can use your will to choose how you want to react and what you want to be able to do. Because like what we're talking here, I mean, we were going to do half white fragility and half anti-racism and allyship, and we're still on the fragility thing, because if we can't get out the door, you can't even get to the table to do the collective work together until we get through how to be able to get beyond the defensiveness, you know what I mean? And then, you know, it really, you know, I'm still thinking about the thing about the will to do this as well, because you still see the same old thing. So like one of the other things is, you know, how with you know, under the rubric of white fragility, but this digging in of the heels. So white people get defensive if you're challenging them. And so the idea of like, you know, and I don't have relationships with white people, or the people who are making policy, it's all white boards that are making the policy. People don't necessarily have training in racism and anti-racism. So it's like anybody can come and do it. And, you know, so where is the will, you know, to say, we need to change how things are doing, you know what I mean? Because the impacts of these things are so huge, you know, but at the same time, it's just switching that can be a simple choice.
As you were just talking, I remembered, you know, just something I talk about, you know, like the silent racist. You know, that's racism is usually silent, you know, like, okay. What I mean by that is that there are a few mad people, right? They are just crazy. They are just like total crazy. They are going out of their way every day to look for who to be racist about. So that's there are few. So, but the one that is problematic is that everyday racism that, you know, we don't, you know, that's why we say that you can actually do racist things without being a racist. You don't need to be a racist to do racist things. You don't need to be a racist to have racist ideas or racist ideologies. However, what happens is that this racism is silent within us. It's mute, it's silent until you meet a trigger. The racism, the everyday racism is silent. We carry it. So until you meet a trigger. And so when I teach, it's really looking at what is your trigger? What triggers the racism within you? What triggers your racist ideas? What triggers your racist beliefs? It's there, it's silent. It's not doing anything.
But the silence, and the silence is also a form of racism, because it just shuts everything down. And that's one of the things that Angelo talks about. Black people, it wears Black people down. It makes it trying to call something out, trying to make a change so miserable that people are unable to keep engaging with it. You know what I mean?
You know, and that's why I was saying, so for change to happen, you know, because I know, like I said, Alice, we can be here forever. We can just keep talking, you know, but really for change to happen was saying that we need allies. We need people who will unmute themselves. We need people who will stop being bystanders. We need people who will be active. You know, we need people who will go out there and challenge policies, you know, because that anti-racist, people are asking, what is it to be an anti-racist? An anti-racist is the person who, number one, accepts that we live in a racist society. Is the person who accepts that my organization has some racist policies and that racism is existing here. That is the anti-racist beginning. Then the anti-racist then progresses to begin to look at how to challenge and how to change some of those policies and some of those practices, and actually making steps, taking action to change some of those racist things that are happening there.
And in between that, in order to do that, is the commitment, because it's all really complex, right? And people you don't necessarily have had any of this in your education. You have to do a lot of hard work in terms of following up, educating yourself, reading about things. Now, and then that's the thing now. I mean, white people can no longer say they don't know, right? And there's been, even just in the last couple of weeks, and I mean, one of the questions people are asking, well, like, why did it take so long? And why did it take such a cost, right? But there have been reading lists, and there is now, you can't, and we have the internet now that we didn't 30 years ago, right? So you can be reading, you can be educating, you can be listening to find out, because part of it is like, well, I know there's something wrong here. I know there's racism in my workplace, but I don't have the language. I don't know how to put forward an analysis, you know what I mean? Or I don't know. And now you can just follow up, like even like the monuments, right? You know, you can now Google any monument you want and you'll find out what the history is. People have to actively look to see where this stuff, it's not just someone's, you know, anecdote or attitude, or it didn't just happen. You have to do that work in order, before you can even start, or while you're trying to think of how can I be active. It's just know where all of this stuff is coming from. And that's why the Trinity students who were organizing and demanding a Black Studies module, right, just a couple of weeks ago, I thought that was so powerful. They said something like, we are being asked to educate ourselves on our white privilege and our racism. And what that tells us is that our education system has failed. And I thought that was one of the most powerful things I've heard in a while, right? Because there is that pressure where people are saying, educate yourself, you're white, you don't know your own history, you don't know our history, you know, what do you know? And so there is a big road that white people need to walk. There is that work, but it's hundreds of years, both within our own lifetimes, but it's also hundreds of years. But the stakes, and coming back to the stakes, what's at stake is in this choice to reflect, to educate yourself, to change your orientation, to interrupt and intervene in all these personal, individual things so that then you can intervene in the institutional and structural things. It's a choice between continuing to be part of oppression and death and choosing to be part of life and bringing change to the world. I mean, that's what's at stake.
Absolutely, absolutely. And really, at the end of the day, what we're asking for is for you to care. Because if you care, you will do so. We just need you to care. You know, we need people to care. We need people to stop talking about it. We need you to care. If you care, you will take action. We act on the things that we care about. So if you're not acting, then you don't care enough. If you think you care and you're not acting, then we're saying care a little bit more. And I'm not saying,
if you're listening,
you're
learning how to care as well.
Absolutely. And the truth is that it's not easy. I'm not saying it's easy, because really for you to do this anti-racist work, it means you need to change a lot of things. It means you also need to admit that, you know, even while I as a white person or even as a Black person, because I said that, you know, like key things that we need to do to be anti-racist, you need to develop a race consciousness. Again, I write about it. My book is coming out on the 26th of July, but I write about how to develop a race consciousness. But you're not born with it, you know? So you learn it, you develop it, you know? So there are things you can do to develop it. I didn't have this level of race consciousness before I left Nigeria. I didn't need it. You know, and so I got here and I needed it and I developed it, and I write about what I did and how I developed it. Do you understand? You know, so looking at that, so we're asking you to care. So I've just read through a quick number of things, and then maybe we might take some questions. I don't know if we have the time for it, but we're saying that, you know, we need more sponsors. People are asking what they can do. We're mentored enough, you know. If you can both mentor and sponsor, that's fine. But if you need to do only one, we need sponsors rather than mentors. Hook me up and I will tell you what I mean by that, because I don't have enough time to go on to it. But the next thing was saying, speak up, unmute yourself, don't be silent. In your office, if you see a line manager being discriminated against somebody, please speak up. It is really exhausting for Black people to be the ones speaking up all the time. We did not create white supremacy. Blacks did not create white supremacy. So it would take white people to overcome white supremacy. It's not a Black problem, it's a we problem, you know, you understand, you know? So
well, but that also reminds me of just the way, so like in terms of speaking up, right? Everybody needs to speak up, right? Because it's not just Black people that aren't being listened to, you know? So I think part of the thing is that white fragility can only lead to anti-racism, because it's all that stuff. We're going to keep doing it the same way we always did it. So even white anti-racists can be met with the same white fragility responses, and it shuts us down, right? So there's that whole thing. So it's even just looking at this from and even, you know, it's lots of prisms and facets to it.
Yeah. So, and that's it, you know, so being an anti-racist means you have to, you know, admit some uncomfortable things. You might need to admit that, you know, yes, I'm really hardworking, but in my hardworkingness, you know, my system has benefited me, has advantaged me unfairly against other people. And that's a really difficult thing to do, you know, to admit that, you know. So, but being anti-racist really means doing all of these things, you know, amplify, you know, marginalized voices. You know, you might need to give up some spaces that you are occupying that you know you shouldn't be occupying. You understand? You know, it might mean sharing your space. It might mean amplifying others. And even me as a Black person, sometimes I need to share that space. I need to give up the spaces I'm occupying. You know, there was an interview I went for, I was like, damn, sorry, did I curse?
Oh.
Okay.
I was worried about me.
I got that before you, Alice. You were supposed to get there first.
But you know what? And that's the thing. I always say, if you're not feeling uncomfortable, you're not doing it right. And you learn, I mean, and so you can look at it the opposite way and saying, when I feel uncomfortable, it's like, I know I'm pushing myself even more. I'm becoming even more, you know what I mean? So yeah, just accept it, accept the discomfort, but see the vision and the goal of where this could get to.
Okay,
like
that's a massive
people right around you.
Stop talking, and we will let Ria give us any questions at all, if there is any. I don't know, did we get any questions?
Yeah, you know what? I haven't even.
Ria, were you supposed to send us questions?
I think there
are a mountain of questions. I'm phoning in without my face. There are so many questions.
Bring your face.
Perhaps another question.
Bring your face with you.
Here's my face. Hey!
Here's your face.
We have been following the questions, the comments, both on Facebook and here, and there's so many incredible comments, insights, thoughts, and questions as well. So perhaps there'll be questions for another day, but if you wanted to have a look quickly in the kind of group that we themed some of the questions
I'm just seeing
together.
one reading list again. Read anything. Read Delgado. You know, critical race theory is a small. We call it the Red Book. You know, so read Delgado's. Is the Red Book. Is the Holy Grail of critical race theory. You can read that. You can read White Fragility by D'Angelo. You can read
Me and White Supremacy.
Right? You can read Ibrahim X. Kendi's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. And then if you have time, he has this really big book called Stamped.
Yeah.
Really good one. It tables the history of, the enslavement, and it tables it so perfectly, but it's a big book. The smaller one is How to Be an Anti-Racist. Again, what's her name now? Why I'm no longer talking to white people.
Yeah.
That's a good one to read. Emma Dabiri, our own Emma, she's Irish as well. So read her book, Don't Touch My Hair. So those are key books you want to read. And Olumo's book, what is it? Well, we can post.
We'll make a list. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's one question I saw. Let me see. Is there any other thing? Alice, did you see any of the questions?
I'm just looking now.
Somebody says, what do you believe UCD can do? I mean,
I was just looking at that one.
I did say I was not going to give out to UCD, but since I'm here, I just take the space. I mean, think about it seriously. I teach Black Studies in UCD. Now, with all of these things happening, nobody has approached me from UCD to say, how can we make this bigger? I'm disappointed. So I'm taking my disappointment and I'm going to set up an Institute of Anti-Racism and Black Studies. Exactly. Yes. And I put my money behind it. I've given up 2.5 hours of my job in the Royal College of Surgeons to do that. I've actually been working on that since last year, and it just came true, so that I can actually have the space to do that. And one of the things I think UCD can do is to make sure that you have a compulsory anti-racism module for all first-year students. Nobody should come through college and not learn about racism. We forgot one of the popular ones, that for somebody to learn how to be, if we need a society of anti-racists, we need to teach them how to be anti-racist. The same way we cannot have doctors and lawyers and architects, if we don't teach them how to be doctors, lawyers, and architects. We cannot have anti-racists if we do not teach them how to
But also too, and I always joke that because we're doing a lot of work on the equality, diversity, and inclusion mandates. And one of the things I always joke about is, if it was an expert panel of people, planning a moon launch, they wouldn't have someone who makes quilts or bakes cookies on it, or even me, right? So if we're doing anti-racism work, And especially if we're all white people, the idea that we don't all need to have specialist training, and I'm not talking about unconscious bias training or a little bit of this or a little bit of that. We have to do the work to make sure that we have the specialist knowledge. You can't just turn up, you know, I mean, granted, there are a lot of things that we can do around white fragility, but in, you know, and things like that, but it's not enough to make policy. And it's also not enough if there isn't enough of Black staff and students. I think students should be involved, and employees. You have to change, you have to work your structure so that there's people in the community. There are people all across Ireland. You can bring people in, because I feel very strongly, I mean, I think we've even shown it today, white people cannot make policy for race equality, right? And I think in this day and age too, there has been, obviously, from a lot of struggle and a lot of movements and mobilizations, you would not be doing that for gender policy or disability or LGBTQ, right? Why? And this always comes back to the race thing. Why is this thing that we do differently when it comes to race? Right? You wouldn't dream of, well, no, unfortunately, because there is the Mantle Watch Twitter account about going, so yes, there are plenty of white men making policy for women and that sort of thing. But even in the culture of our own university, we have started to bring that in, and we need to stretch that.
Yeah, again, one question says, is whiteness tied to economic systems of Black or brown oppression? Absolutely. You know, if you look at it, like racism, race was created. There were slaves before, enslaved people before race came in. But after a while, they actually then realized that actually, you know, we can keep this set of people as our slaves. And so what did happen? You know, the same way you can use an animal to farm and not feel guilty for pushing them and pushing them, they needed to dehumanize Black people so that they can produce on our lands, you know, in our plantations. And so that's why race and racism came up. So it's not separated, it is economic. It is economic. And if you look at all the policies that are there, what are they there for? They are there to keep some people marginalized. Oh, you cannot, you know, apply for this kind of jobs if you're not a citizen. You know, and I'm not saying it's right or wrong. I'm just saying if we're doing that, let us say we are operating racist policies. That's fine. You know, so you don't want us to say you're egalitarian at the same time you're practicing racist policies. That's my own argument. Just own it. Do it, but own it.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and that shows too how a small thing, you know, the smallest little defensiveness leads to and is interlinked with global systems of inequality. You know, or even just national things, the citizenship referendum, direct provision, the systems of foreign aid and development. They're all wound up in the same thing. So tiny, micro to massive global.
Yeah, I think there was one interesting question, and I showed some slides. So I don't have an answer of my own. So I'm just going to copyright the answers which I showed in the slides yesterday. You know, somebody is asking about all lives matter and, you know, and all of that. Again, it is this white denial. It is this white shut up. You know, it's trying to
shut it down.
You know, so that you're defensive, so that you're already angry, so that in addition to white rage, we now have Black rage. You understand? Yeah, because, you know, when they say that, instead of you to focus on the issue at hand, then it actually stirs up, you know, Black rage. You know, but one of the best answers I saw, and, you know, anybody who says that, you know, all lives matter, what you want to do to them is on their birthday, right? Go to their house on their birthday, wear your birthday finest, and celebrate your birthday on their birthday. When it's time to open the presents, open all the presents, because all birthdays matter. Do you understand? When they are blowing out their candle, push them and blow out the candle. Because if all lives matter in that way, then all birthdays matter. You know, another person said that all lives matter is like, you know, going to Martin Luther King, you know, to say, oh, when Martin Luther King, I had a dream, say, oh, telling them about your own dream. You understand? It's like, you know, going to Martin Luther King and telling him, you know, about your
I had a dream.
So yeah, so Twitter is good. I mean, Twitter is bad and good. Like sometimes it attacks me and it's really crazy. But sometimes, you know, you just learn so many interesting things. So I picked those up from Twitter. So, you know, copyrights.
Brilliant. Thank you both so much. I'm conscious we're at 8 o'clock now. And I would love to extend this conversation for another hour or two, actually. And I know that you two would be up for that if we were able to do that. So, I think we've only got started.
Next time you bring us like this, you should have ordered the chicken. So
yeah.
Then it'll be all fine.
Noted. That is me told.
Okay.
No, I think there are so many more angles and areas to discuss and explore, as evidenced by the invigoration I think that we're receiving from yourselves from this conversation, and the sheer volume of chat and questions as well. So thank you both for such an amazing window in.
Thank you. Thank you.
Such a pleasure, and thank you everyone for joining us as well. I have a couple of wee housekeeping things just to say before we go. Just to say thank you for tuning in and thank you for being a part of this. If you're interested in more conversations like this, Ebun is doing loads of things. And I'm sure, Alice, as the academic year comes around, there will be lots more as well, kind of in person or on webinar series to follow up on. But there are also lots of things, as we mentioned, to read and to explore. So do your own research and really like dig in, because once you start, there's so much there. We'll be sharing a little bit more if and where we can, but also stay connected and look at the wider sphere there. We're also going to be back on Thursday, the 16th of July, with a talk exploring the transformational power of community engaged learning, with Dr. Deirdre McGillicuddy, Hilda Loughran, and Gary Broderick from the SAIL project. So do join us if you are able to join us in 2 weeks' time for that session. We'd also be delighted to hear your suggestions on future conversation topics for this UCD in Conversation series. I think this is a great example of something that maybe isn't about COVID-19, but is so there. So assume you have it and don't spread it. But simply email us at alumni@ucd.ie and we're happy to take any of your suggestions. So that concludes our event for this evening. Thank you so much for being here. And we really genuinely look forward to welcoming you at our next session.
Thank you.
Stay safe, stay well.
Stay safe.
Good night.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.